Hi students, welcome to the Chapter 15 lecture. In this lecture, I'm going to be covering the autonomic nervous system and visceral reflexes. Alright, so what does the term autonomic mean and how does it relate to our nervous system? Well, autonomic means self-governed, and the autonomic nervous system is basically considered a division of the nervous system that is independent of our will. So this is the system of neurons that are keeping track of internal conditions and basically relaying conditions about the state of the body to the central nervous system and then carrying out appropriate actions. So it is a division of the nervous system, as I said. Remember that we really only have one nervous system, and the way that we divvy it up is basically just for better comprehending its different functions. So what it does is it regulates fundamental states and life processes, such as heart rate, blood pressure, and body temperature. And Walter Cannon, who was an American physician and the head of the physiology department at Harvard Medical School, coined the terms homeostasis and the flight or fight. So homeostasis, of course, basically maintaining a fairly steady internal state. So things like blood pressure, internal temperature, respiration, cardiac output, all of these sort of fundamental processes that occur in living organisms. The mechanisms that keep all of those parameters within kind of a set normal range, that falls into that category of homeostasis. And then the flight or fight refers to the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, which we will be discussing in this lecture. So Walter Cannon really dedicated his career to the study of the autonomic nervous system, or ANS. And interestingly, he found that animals without the ANS cannot survive on their own. And on the flip side, of course, animals that do not have an intact autonomic nervous system, it's kind of surprising in some ways that they can survive under any conditions. But animals without a functional ANS have to be kept warm and in a stress-free environment in order to continue living. So when you see that word autonomic, you probably think automatic, and that is really a good synonym for what this system does because it is independent of our will. So it is basically keeping track of the fundamental states of our body without us actually having to consciously think about it. So this is in contrast to what we have to do to move our skeletal muscles. That is a conscious process. So the ANS is a motor nervous system that controls glands, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Now let's think about this for a moment. Motor. There's two major divisions of the nervous system aside from, CNS and PNS, and that would be motor versus sensory. So motor, when you see that word motor, think movement or output. So that's going to be basically mediated by the efferent neurons connected to our effector organs. Sensory, on the other hand, is basically just gathering information about the state of our body and the state of the environment. So responding to, well, not necessarily responding to stimuli, but just gathering information about the stimuli. And then the motor system is what basically affects changes in the body. So motor nervous system, we're only dealing with actual actions on the part of effector organs, not sensing information. And what it controls are glands. So for example, endocrine system, primarily comprised of glands. Some of our reproductive system organs, also comprised of glands. Cardiac muscle, of course, is the heart. And then smooth muscle. So smooth muscle is an involuntary type of muscle that we don't consciously control its contraction. So it is also called the visceral motor system because we are primarily controlling the movement of glands and viscera or internal organs. So the primary organs that are ultimately controlled by the autonomic nervous system are going to be the viscera of the thoracic and abdominal cavities, so heart, lungs, digestive organs, for example. And some structures of the body wall, so cutaneous blood vessels, sweat glands, and piloerector muscles. Those are the little smooth muscle bundles that are connected to body hair and are responsible ultimately for our hair standing on end in the event of goosebumps. So the autonomic nervous system, as I've stated, carries out actions involuntarily. So this is without our conscious intent or awareness. Now, interestingly, visceral effectors, meaning the glands or cardiac or smooth muscle themselves, those do not depend on the ANS to function, only to adjust their activity to the body's changing needs. So without having an intact autonomic nervous system, it's not as if our heart would stop beating. Its resting heart rate would just be a lot higher than it is with an intact ANS. So what happens if you do have a severed nerve, for example, in the autonomic nervous system is this phenomenon known as denervation hypersensitivity. So denervation would be if we were to cut a nerve of the autonomic nervous system that actually allows for changes to occur in glands and smooth and cardiac muscle, you would see an exaggerated response. So, for example, respiration rate would increase, heart rate would increase, and those are not necessarily going to be conducive to long-term maintenance of homeostasis, particularly in an environment that is non-ideal. So let's look at the visceral reflex arc, and from what we've already talked about with spinal reflexes, for example, this will probably look fairly familiar to you. Same basic pattern with just a few differences that I'll be pointing out. So receptors are, of course, our nerve endings. Those can be free nerve endings. Those could be photoreceptors, for example. Anything that's going to detect stimuli. Now remember that the visceral motor system is only really looking at the output side of things, but we still have to have a way to gather information about the current state of the environment and our internal body. So it's all connected, but the autonomic nervous system is really looking at the output side of things. So it focuses on the efferent neurons and then the effector organs. But still we have our receptors, we have our afferent neurons that allow for action potentials to be sent to the central nervous system about the state of the environment, about the state of our body. The interneurons within the CNS are basically the neurons that, quote unquote, decide what action to take regarding the stimuli, that the data that's gathered about the stimuli informs that action. And then we have our efferent neurons that are out of the CNS. And then our effector organs themselves, which again are the glands, the smooth and cardiac muscles in the case of the visceral motor system. So those are what actually carry out the response. Now, something that differs between our autonomic nervous system and the somatic motor pathway that we saw with the neuromuscular junction is our efferent neurons. We actually have two neurons in the pathway. We have what's known as a preganglionic and a postganglionic efferent neuron, and I'll be talking more about that in the rest of this lecture. So, like I said, the autonomic nervous system really is generally limited to those motor or efferent pathways. So let's look at an example. We have our receptor, in this case baroreceptors, within the internal carotid artery. Those are going to sense increased blood pressure. Baro has to do with pressure, so they are sensing whether blood pressure increases, decreases, stays within kind of normal homeostatic ranges. So the baroreceptors are going to sense an increase in blood pressure. That information is going to travel via the glossopharyngeal nerve, transmitting the signal via action potential to the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. That's where our integrating center is for this information. So this would be our interneuron, illustrated here. And then our efferent or motor neurons, we're going to see two of those. So the vagus nerve transmits inhibitory signals to the cardiac pacemaker. So that's our first or preganglionic effector neuron. And then this right here is going to be your second or postganglionic neuron in this effector pathway. So ultimately what happens here, it's a feedback loop. The heart rate is going to decrease. And just to test your knowledge of feedback loops, would this be a positive or a negative feedback loop, and why? So this would be a negative feedback loop because ultimately you have a corrective action being carried out. You don't have a runaway effect where you see higher and higher blood pressure. You have this feedback system where the body brings blood pressure back down via a decreased heart rate. Okay, let's look at our divisions of the autonomic nervous system. We have our sympathetic and our parasympathetic divisions. Sympathetic division is going to adapt the body for physical activity. This is where that phrase fight or flight comes into play. Parasympathetic is kind of going to have opposite effects. In a lot of ways, it has a calming effect on the body, and rest and digest is kind of the term that's used to describe the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So let's take a look at these two systems here. Now there's several things I'd like to point out here. One, you'll notice that the organs and what is actually being innervated here are largely the same. So in both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system, the organs are the same. And what this is known as is dual innervation. Now there are a few exceptions to this, but by and large you're going to see dual innervation with our smooth cardiac and gland effectors, meaning they're innervated by both the sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. With the sympathetic, the other name for this, aside from fight or flight, due to the locations of where the fibers are actually emerging from the spinal cord, this is also known as the thoracolumbar division, because it's originating from the area of the thoracic vertebrae and the lumbar vertebrae. And then notice with the parasympathetic basically means nearby or around the sympathetic. That's what para means, nearby or around. And you'll notice that there are fibers emerging from the brainstem, which is above where the fibers start to emerge for the sympathetic, and also way down here at the sacral area. So it basically flanks the nerve fibers of the parasympathetic system. And again, as a result of where these fibers are emerging, it is known as the craniosacral division. Craniosacral. Okay, so dual innervation, the other names for these divisions based on where their fibers are actually emerging. And then you might notice another difference between these two. It's going to be the relative lengths of the preganglionic fibers versus the postganglionic fibers. So with the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic fibers are short and the postganglionic fibers are long. So preganglionic fibers are illustrated in red, postganglionic are illustrated in blue. And remember that a ganglion is basically just a concentration of neurosomas, neural cell bodies. In this case, the ganglia are concentrated on either side of the spinal cord. They are a paravertebral chain ganglia. And then with our parasympathetic system, the ganglia are kind of distributed closer to the effector organs or even within the effector organs. So we don't have this cohesive chain of ganglia. We have the ganglia way out here. So again, this is just where you're going to see the synapse between your preganglionic and postganglionic fibers, and you're going to have millions of synapses in a single ganglion. It's basically just where you have a concentration of cell bodies. So I'll be talking more about the similarities and differences of both sympathetic and parasympathetic. All right, so autonomic tone. What this means is it's related to the fact that both the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system divisions are going to be active within the body at any given time. They both exhibit what's kind of referred to as a background rate of activity that's called autonomic tone. And both divisions actually have excitatory and inhibitory effects. So, for example, the sympathetic nervous system is going to excite the heart but inhibit digestive and urinary functions, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system has opposite effects. So, in what situation might you need increased cardiac output, for example? And in what situation might you not necessarily be worrying about digesting food and expelling urine? A great example would be during exercise. So sympathetic nervous system fibers are going to excite the heart. It's going to increase respiratory and cardiac output while decreasing digestive and urinary output. Parasympathetic nervous system is basically going to have opposite effects. It's going to be exciting digestive and perhaps urinary system while inhibiting heart rate respiration in the case of you've just eaten a large meal and your body is basically focused on processing those nutrients. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the autonomic nervous system components within the central nervous system. So even though the focus of this lecture is really looking at the efferent neurons and the effector organs themselves, there are still going to be components that are necessary within the central nervous system itself for ANS function. And remember from our discussion of the brain, generally speaking, the lower you are within the brain, meaning basically the closer you are to the brain stem, the more basic the functions are. By basic, I mean things like just maintaining blood pressure and respiration rate, maintaining homeostasis. The higher you are in the brain, the more complex or complicated the functions get, like critical thinking and memory consolidation. So you will notice that the ANS components within the central nervous system are going to tend to be lower within the brain. So we have control nuclei within the hypothalamus and the brainstem, motor neurons within the spinal cord and peripheral ganglia, and then nerve fibers in cranial and spinal nerves as well. All right, as I've mentioned, we see both preganglionic and postganglionic fibers within the ANS, and the relative length of these fibers is going to vary depending on sympathetic versus parasympathetic. The preganglionic fiber is going to be myelinated, whereas your postganglionic fiber is going to be unmyelinated. So what does myelination mean again? In the case of our peripheral nervous system, which will include our effector components of the ANS, we have Schwann cells, which are going to effectively wrap around portions of axons and help to insulate the internal electrical and chemical environment from the outer electrical and chemical environment. So we have our preganglionic fibers being myelinated and our postganglionic fibers being unmyelinated. So which of these is going to have a faster conduction speed and why? You're going to have a faster conduction speed with your preganglionic fibers because myelination along with fiber diameter is going to increase the speed at which an action potential is conducted. So our postganglionic fibers use what's known as a chain of varicosities that diffusely release neurotransmitter into a target tissue. So this is a little bit different than what we've seen at the neuromuscular junction, where we have this very localized synapse between an axon terminal and a target skeletal muscle cell. Generally speaking, you're going to see a little bit more widespread effects due to this pattern of neurotransmitter release, especially in the sympathetic nervous system. You have less localized effects. Let's compare somatic and autonomic pathways. So what we've really looked at before in terms of efferent pathways had to do with our neuromuscular junctions. So when we were looking at muscle cell physiology, this is the pattern that we were studying. With our somatic efferent innervation, we have our motor output exiting the ventral or anterior horn of the spinal cord. We have our myelinated fibers, one long axon reaching all the way from its origin in the spinal cord to its effector. Now with autonomic nervous system innervation, we see preganglionic and postganglionic fibers. No matter if you're in the PSNS or the SNS, the only thing that really differs is type of neurotransmitter and relative length of the fibers. So we have our myelinated preganglionic fiber that's emerging again from the spinal cord, in this case the lateral horn of the spinal cord. Then we have our autonomic ganglion. So this is where the synapse is going to occur between our preganglionic and our postganglionic fiber. That postganglionic fiber is going to be unmyelinated. Now with our somatic efferent innervation, we've looked at acetylcholine as the sole neurotransmitter. Acetylcholine or norepinephrine are the neurotransmitters that we're going to be discussing in this context. And of course, our effector organs are going to differ. We're going to have cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands.